This is Focus with Jack Caudill.
Good evening, I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome to this month's edition of Focus. This month we're talking about human trafficking. Three guests with us to shed some light on that. Tess Franzen is the founder and executive director of Freedom's Journey, also a founder of the South Dakota West River Human Trafficking Task Force. Heather Knox is an assistant U.S. attorney. She is the human trafficking coordinator for the District of South Dakota and the co-chair of the West River Human Trafficking Task Force. And Evy Hall from Valley City, North Dakota. She is a human trafficking survivor and now an advocate for human trafficking. Now, since its inception, the National Human Trafficking Hotline has identified more than 82,000 cases of human trafficking, has identified more than 164,000 victims here in South Dakota. Since 2007, the hotline has received 909 signals, including 745 hotline calls. They say that translates to 175 cases of human trafficking and 579 identified victims. 29 of those cases and 63 of the victims came in 2021. Tess Franzen, we're going to start with you. When we say human trafficking, that is a very wide, very vague term. What are we talking about when we're talking about human trafficking?
Our task force defines human trafficking as the commercial exploitation of an individual for sex or labor through force, fraud, or coercion. But if the victim is under the age of 18, force, fraud, and coercion don't have to be proven. It is assumed.
Now, most people think of this human trafficking as strictly a sexual thing. Is that the case?
Most of the cases that we've worked with here in South Dakota have been sex trafficking, but we've also worked with people who were labor trafficking victims, and we've worked with some who were victims of both types of trafficking.
Now, Heather, you deal with this on the legal side as well. Legally, what is human trafficking?
Well, fortunately, the federal definition of trafficking really mirrors, or maybe it's vice versa, the definition that the task force uses. It is coercion, either force, fraud, or coercion. It is commercial exploitation, generally for sex, but also it can be forced labor, things like that. Again, as Tess mentioned, if the victim, survivor, is under 18, force, fraud, or coercion is presumed under the law.
Now, most people around here in South Dakota could go their whole lives without ever thinking about it, without ever having any contact with it. How common is it here?
I think it's becoming more common with the advance of technology, for sure, but also the incidences that I think we're seeing from a prosecution and law enforcement standpoint are increasing because our education is getting better. When we know better, we do better, really, and when law enforcement and prosecutors get better trained, get better educated about what trafficking is and what it isn't, what it might be and what it might not be, we're better able to identify what those signs are, what the danger signs are, what the evidence looks like. For a lot of us, I think trafficking historically has been presumed to be just prostitution. Survivors or victims who have a choice in the matter, who could choose differently if they wanted to. But what we're finding as our education has gotten better, as we've had more contact with survivors like Evy, is that trafficking can look like a lot of different things. And it is the force, fraud, or coercion that compels someone to engage in this type of behavior. If I could analogize it to, say, in the case of someone who's addicted to drugs and is being sex trafficked, for example, as a way to maintain their supply of drugs, to maintain really the avoidance of withdrawals. Let's say you're underwater and you need air. What wouldn't you do for a breath of air if your life is running out? That is what it's like, I believe, for survivors of trafficking to be going through withdrawal symptoms, say from methamphetamine, from whatever drug, be it alcohol, be it nicotine, whatever it is. There's nothing you wouldn't do if you're underwater and need a breath of air. So I would like for the public to think of trafficking survivors as it's not a choice that they make. It's something that they are compelled to do. Really, a fight, flight, or flight scenario where they're just trying to survive. And what wouldn't you do to survive?
Now, Tess, you've been fighting this fight for a long time. How much of this do you see around here?
I've been working against trafficking and assisting survivors for the past 11 years. And we have assisted hundreds of people who have come out of trafficking, and in some cases people who are at very high risk. I would say it's far more common than any of us would be comfortable understanding. The vast majority of the trafficking survivors we have worked with were trafficked as children by members of their family or people who are in other positions of trust. And then as they get older, the trafficking can translate into something that's more gang-related, cartel-related even, or networking.
Now, Evy, we mentioned earlier, you are a human trafficking survivor. What is your story?
Well, I was born into kind of a complicated situation. My mother was a victim. She was not identified as a victim, but she was a victim nonetheless. I am a product of my environment. I have been out of the life for 8 years this past December. When I think about what you're talking about, when it's, you know, sometimes drug related, survival related, it isn't just, I would add to that, it's not just looking at drug related or connected to addiction. Sometimes it is needing a safe place to lay your head at night. Maybe some of these victims, they are thinking that they'll run away, right? They run away from, say they run away from their trafficker, they think they're in a safe place and they're, oh, well, I'll help you, you can stay here, you know, there's no strings attached. And then they build up your trust, and then when you least expect it, well, you owe me, what are you gonna do? You've done all this, you've done all that. So it's not just familial trafficking, or you've got various types of it. Sometimes there's, you know, your Romeo pimps, who's a boyfriend or a significant other, someone who has placed interest in you, and they're someone who is coming to sweep you off your feet, and you're blindsided.
Now you talk about running away. What are the challenges that you see when it was time to get out, when you decided, I'm getting out of this?
Well, when I got out, I didn't even know what human trafficking was. I thought everybody did what I was doing. Again, it started from a very young age. I was failed by systems that were in place to protect me, whether it was law enforcement, educational professionals, social services. There were people who, had they been educated to know what human trafficking was, because 30 years ago, it wasn't a conversation. I actually had run away from my trafficker, and I ended up in a Waffle House in Biloxi, Mississippi, and by the grace of God, a law enforcement officer came in, and he immediately recognized that something was wrong.
Now, obviously, this is very difficult to talk about today. Why is it important for you to get out there, and even though that is difficult as that is, to talk about this today?
Number one, because I'm a mother. Number two, because people took a chance to rescue me, to save me, to give me a life. And it's my privilege to try to give back. I find it healing. A lot of people have asked me, well, why wouldn't you just leave that alone? Leave that in the past. You're out, you're good now. Pretend it didn't happen and move on. Well, it doesn't work that way. There's constant reminders. Being hypervigilant is not something I can turn off. I'm constantly aware of my surroundings, and I've learned to lean on that instinct for survival. And I'm not ashamed of my past, because it wasn't my choice. I am not what was done to me, and the victims and the survivors out there, they are not what was done to them. There is hope. There is a way out. And it's tough, but it's worth it. People like Freedom's Journey, the prosecutors, there are incredible law enforcement agencies and organizations out there. It took me a long time to be able to trust, because in the past I thought I would trust and I was getting out, and really I ended up in an even worse situation. And part of my personal battle for me, and I see that with other victims, with other survivors, is that when they have an opportunity to be rescued, to be out of the life, they're not able to, because there's still a part of us that would hold on. We weren't really willing to give 100% trust. And so it wasn't until I let go and I truly trusted these individuals, because at that point, you're either going to truly help me or you're going to put me out of my misery. And it wasn't until I let go that I found growth.
We got to take a break. We'll continue our look at human trafficking when we continue with this month's edition of Focus. I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about human trafficking. Tess Franzen is the founder and executive director of Freedom's Journey and the founder of the South Dakota West River Human Trafficking Task Force. And before we went to the break, Evy was talking about being fortunate enough that someone recognized the signs that she was somebody in trouble. What do you look for?
I don't know if it's as much what you look for as the relationships that you build with the people in the community. Of course, there are some signs. Someone who won't look you in the eye, or someone who, seems to be disoriented. Sometimes it's someone who is on the street and doing drugs, and you might want to take a second look and ask a few more questions. But what I find is that it's building that relationship of trust with the people that you come in contact with. Maybe someone who ends up at a shelter, someone who ends up in a healthcare facility. If you can operate in such a way and be a trusting person, a safe person, then they may disclose and let you know what's going on. Sometimes you'll find someone who is in for something else, domestic violence, and you ask a few more questions, and they finally learn to trust you enough to let you know that there's more to it. I would say it's being aware of the people around you and being a safe person so that when they're ready to talk, they have someone they can talk to.
How tough is it to get people to come forward and talk about what's going on?
Not as hard as it used to be. When I started doing this back in 2012 and 2013, nobody was talking about human trafficking, and as Evy said earlier, the victims often don't identify as victims. They don't realize that there is something called human trafficking, and one of the things Marty Jackley told me at the time was, we know there are a lot of victims out there, but they won't come forward until we can provide better options. So that's what we have been working to do with Freedom's Journey and our task force, and all of our partner agencies connected with the task force is working to provide better options for the victims and the survivors so that when they are ready to come forward, they have a place where they can come forward to, and there are resources and people who are willing to walk with them.
Heather Knox is an assistant U.S. attorney, the human trafficking coordinator for the District of South Dakota, and the co-chair of the West River Human Trafficking Task Force. Heather, who is it? Who is the common person that's getting pulled into this? Is it young people, old people, rich people, poor people? Who is it?
I think we're finding that it's across the spectrum. It can be young, it can be old, any race, any gender, any sex, any nationality, really. Trafficking is a crime of exploitation. So a person, a trafficker who's willing to exploit another person for either forced labor or commercial sex, it's really the traffickers who tend to be very good at figuring out, what's this person's currency? Is it a debt that they owe? Is it drug addiction? It might not be. Is it they don't have a place to stay? Is it they don't have somewhere safe to put their children at night? It's whatever that is. So because every person's currency, so to speak, of course, is different, all of the survivors are different. There's no cookie cutter survivor. It's really, I think, the traffickers who have that common characteristic of being very good at picking out a vulnerable person and exploiting whatever their vulnerability is.
Evy Hall is a human trafficking survivor and now an advocate out of Valley City, North Dakota. Is that kind of what you went through, that somebody just finds those vulnerabilities and takes advantage of that?
I would say yes. But I would also want to make sure that the viewers understand, that the community understands that it's not even just a vulnerable population. So as she had mentioned about, it doesn't know an age, a sex, a denomination, a religion, ability or disability. Everyone is priceless. It doesn't matter how good of a home, family, home environment, support system that you have. None of that matters when it involves human trafficking. Where I believe everyone is priceless, on the streets to a trafficker, there's something that I had mentioned to Tess, the freakier the fetish, the more money you're worth. So where you've got John Q over here who's interested in 4 and 5-year-olds or infants or teenagers, you might have someone else a few blocks over who would be interested in your great-grandparents. You today, at your age, your great-grandparents. There is no age limit. There's no separation as to what they would be considered worth.
Heather, when we look at, she's talking about somebody wanting young kids. How much of this are we seeing with underage victims?
We're seeing tons of exploitation of minors online. Even if it doesn't rise to the level of trafficking as far as the federal legal definition is, my work with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, they're busier than ever. They're getting what we call cyber tips from the various internet service providers and apps, Google, Gmail, Snapchat, Instagram, daily. So much of that here in our community, not just nationwide, but the exploitation that people are willing to perpetrate upon children is off the charts right now. So if I can say anything to parents and even friends, peer groups, is pay attention to who you're talking to online. We're seeing just a huge incidence of people pretending to be younger than they are, asking for nude photos of children in our community that they're talking to, and exploiting them for nude images, nude videos, things like that. And all too frequently, it turns out to be a scam, exploitation for the purpose of producing child pornography, child sexual abuse imagery, passing it online, exploiting kids for money. So it's very prevalent right here in Rapid City.
We look at this every year during the Sturgis Rally. There's a sting every year at the Sturgis Rally with people posing as underage kids. Everybody knows this is happening year after year, and every year, here's a list of people we caught. Does it ever surprise you anymore?
It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me that they are almost always local, almost always men. That doesn't surprise me in the least. And truth be told, if we had the resources to be in those proactive operations all year, we could do it 24/7, 365. There are agents, chatting all the time. For example, they'll start an undercover profile, and within minutes, they're getting dozens and dozens of friend requests from generally men they don't know. Hey, sending messages like, hey, you're cute. How old are you? Do you have pictures? Things like that, just all year long. So it doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. So people really need to be vigilant about what their kids are doing online.
All right, we got to take another break. We'll continue our look at human trafficking when we return with this month's edition of Focus. I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about human trafficking. And Evy Hall is a human trafficking survivor, now an advocate for survivors of human trafficking. Talking during the break, we mentioned that perpetrators, people largely think of them as men, but you say that's not always the case.
No, there are a lot of females, whether God-given or transitioned, people who identify as women. They are just as guilty as for trafficking. In fact, in my experience, they are more manipulative. They're more conniving. They're able to prey on that nurturing instinct that, to call someone in, to manipulate them and trick them into trusting them.
What would you say to somebody that's in this and wants to get out? What advice do you have for somebody that's trying to get out of this?
The first thing is to recognize that no is a complete sentence, and if it doesn't feel good, that there's something wrong. So you have to be able to first identify with yourself that, hey, I'm being abused, I'm being trafficked. I would say to reach out to organizations. There are numbers on the back of bathroom doors in all kinds of public locations, truck stops, gas stations. I think they should be in changing rooms because things take place there, even in the stores. To reach out, find an agency, an organization here in Rapid City, Freedom's Journey, you know. There's the Polaris, the hotline. Call that. They will put you in touch with a safe place, a safe, vetted person that can help you start your life over.
Heather Knox is an assistant U.S. Attorney, human trafficking coordinator for the District of South Dakota and the co-chair of the West River Human Trafficking Task Force. What's available? What kind of resources are available for somebody that's trapped in this, looking to get out?
Yeah, well, not only are there law enforcement victim specialists, victim advocates, but groups like Tess's, Freedom's Journey. We're finding that when we initially come in contact with survivors, usually they don't self-identify as survivors. There's probably somebody watching this who is full of shame or what have you, for whom these things are happening to them, and they probably think it's their fault. I would say that stabilizing the survivors is the most important thing, because they can call 911 and we can take their information. But if we don't have services in place to stabilize them, we haven't done them any service at all, because they have nowhere else to go. They're not stabilized. They have no choice in the matter initially. So if we don't give them other options, they're going to end up right back in the life.
The other thing that I would want to add to that, though, is that for a law enforcement standpoint, for an organization standpoint, I think it's important to recognize that when you help a victim and that victim runs away, they don't, just because you help them and you get them into a safe place, it's not open and closed. Mm-hmm. More often than not, that victim is going to continue going back to what they know. And and before, they'll do that multiple times before they really realize that, number one, you're truly no strings attached going to help them.
Yeah.
Tess Franzen is the founder of Freedom's Journey. Got about a minute to go. Tell me about your group. How do they get a hold of you guys? What do you guys do?
You can get us on our website at freedomsjourney.us. We do have a number there. It's a voicemail number. If you would like to volunteer, you can email us. If you are a victim in an emergency situation, we do ask that you contact 911, because we do not, as a nonprofit, we do not do rescues. We let law enforcement do that. I would say, we do provide resources and help survivors navigate that journey, in whatever way we're able to. But I would say with our task force, one of the reasons when I started it, with the people we put around the table, they are, yes, law enforcement agencies, they're direct service providers. There's so many other agencies and individuals that we can wrap around these people, and we can provide a lot of options.
I hate to cut you off, but I have to. I want to thank you guys for coming up. Tess Franzen, Heather Knox, Evy Hall, thank you for joining us for this month's edition of Focus. See you again the first Sunday night of next month.